Have you ever wondered what it takes to be a cookbook critic or how a cookbook critic reviews cookbooks? Well, you've come to the right place. Welcome to Everything Cookbooks, the podcast for writers, readers, and cooks. This is Kate Leahy, and today Andrea Nguyen is joining me for a special episode in which we go into what makes a cookbook stand out. It's my pleasure to introduce our guest today. Paula Forbes is a longtime cookbook critic and the editor of Stained Page News, a newsletter all about cookbooks. Based in Austin, Texas, she's the author of The Austin Cookbook and is a frequent contributor to Texas Monthly. She may or may not have a new cookbook project in the works, and we'll be sure to ask her about that by the end of the show. Paula, welcome.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks for being here. So just to get us started, I wanted to kind of hear your superhero origin story. When did you decide cookbook critic was an actual career you could have? And, just to rewind, what is a cookbook critic?
Sure, yeah. So the jury's still out on if it's an actual career one can have, but I do try. I started out in college. In undergraduate, I decided that I wanted to be an academic, actually. I wanted to go to grad school, get my PhD. And what I wanted to do was I wanted to study food, restaurant food specifically, sort of like how an art historian would study art and use cookbooks that the restaurants produce as these sort of like landmarks for that. So after I graduated from undergrad, I was, working in restaurants and applying to grad school. And I realized that my brain was kind of slowing down. Like I wasn't like in that intellectual academic area while I was doing this. So I started freelancing. I started writing first for my own blog and later for other outlets, writing about cookbooks because that was what I wanted to do. I wanted to keep that muscle sort of working. And, as I'm applying to all these grad schools, this was a little bit ago. I think you could probably do this now, but the response I kept getting was, well, you're a great candidate, but we don't have anyone here who can help you. I was applying to American Studies, I was applying to comparative lit, I was applying to all of these different programs, and now there are food studies programs that you can go to, but at the time it was sort of an exotic thing to want to study. As I'm doing this, I'm freelancing, and I started reviewing cookbooks for a website that no longer exists called Eat Me Daily. That was, a sort of look at culture through the lens of food. And eventually I just decided that I would rather pursue the writing and not the academic part of it. So yeah, from there, I went and worked for Eater. I've written for Epicurious. I was the cookbook critic for Eater, Epicurious, Lucky Peach, and Food52 for a little while.
So let's back up a little bit, Paula, because, I find it so fascinating. And I had no idea that you were pursuing an academic career because way back in the early 90s, I had considered an academic career to pursue food studies too. And I was laughed at. Mm-hmm. I spoke to historians. I ended up in anthropology, and one historian said to me, oh, well, we don't study that. But you know what? Why don't you go and teach cooking classes or something like that? It was sort of like, oh, this is women's work. And it wasn't rigor.
Mm-hmm. So true. I had a similar experience. When I was an undergrad, I really was interested too. Paula, I feel like I've been there before, but I didn't take as many steps as you took. I wanted to study food, and I thought, well, maybe I could be a food historian. But at the time, in the late 90s, all the books about culture, they all called food as sort of like this, not an important part of culture. That was sort of the academia at the time. And so people thought, your writing's kind of more conversational. Maybe you should be a journalist. So that's so interesting that it also happened to you, Andrea.
Yeah, because I didn't think that I could get a cookbook deal. I didn't think that was something that was the industry for me to be in. I didn't have a place in it, but I loved cookbooks. And Paula, what brought you to be interested in cookbooks?
Yes. I've always been interested in cookbooks since I was a little kid. Actually, in the newsletter just last week, we ran a story by a freelancer, Mara Eakin, who wrote about kids' cookbooks. And we were talking about the kids' cookbooks we've loved. And I when I was 10, 11, 12, I was reading Little House Cookbook and the American Girls Cookbook and all of those things. So I've had a long simmering interest in cookbooks. My academic interest in them began when I realized that I was very interested in literary criticism and that this was a field of literature that hadn't really been looked at through that lens. And I found it over the years to be a very fertile ground for talking about things like rhetoric. How do we tell people how to do things? How do we write something down so that the actions can be replicated? Those kinds of things are the really like chewy bits of cookbooks that I find interesting. So it was sort of through a combination of my academic interests. I cooked in restaurants during and after college, and just realizing that there was this whole literary sphere that hadn't really been explored in the way I wanted to explore it yet. So yeah, and then I went from there. And obviously now, I'm not the only person who's ever had this idea. And obviously now there are a lot of people who look at cookbooks and take them seriously in this way. Your podcast is proof of that. But that's how I got into it.
Well, that explains the rigor that you exhibit when you review a book. If you're lucky to have Paula review one of your books, it is a joy, I have to tell you.
Oh,
it really, really is.
I'm happy to hear you say that.
Well, and that brings me to the question of right now, anybody who writes a book, Paula, you're an author, we're all authors, everyone seems to be a critic now too. You go on Amazon, you get reviews. You get reviews on, Goodreads, you get reviews from Instagram. So how do you make your professional perspective stand out? I mean, you've talked about your background, but how do you make sure that gets down on the page when you're doing a review? What keeps the way you look at it apart from, say, another review from somebody posting on Instagram about something they liked?
Sure. I think the most basic way to answer that question is that I test recipes, of course. And when I'm testing them in a different way than a home cook might. So let's say Goodreads, we're looking at the same cookbook. Someone on Goodreads might cook something for their family for dinner. It's not to their particular taste. So they give it a bad review. Oh, I don't like asparagus, so I'm going to give this recipe, like that kind of thing.
Oh, seriously, yeah.
When I look at a recipe, I don't think it matters whether or not I personally like it. It's more about the promise built into the recipe. Does this recipe do what it claims to do? Am I able to follow it clearly? Did I perhaps learn something from it? Was I surprised that it turned out maybe better than I had expected? Is it giving me information beyond just how to make this recipe? So is it saying, if you do X, Y, and Z, this is a better way to caramelize onions. This is a better way to roast potatoes, whatever the thing is. So it's not about my personal taste. It's about the communication between the author and the person performing the activities in the kitchen and the language it's written with. And those are the factors I look at for the recipe. For that book itself as a whole, I think that cookbooks are a really interesting genre because it's so different. So when you have a recipe on a website or in a magazine and it's just one recipe, that's one thing. But a cookbook is teaching you an entire system, right? So it's teaching you how someone sets up their kitchen, how they move through leftovers, how they deal with pantry. Maybe they're telling you about a culture or place you've never been before. Maybe they're telling you new strategies for making pizza or for tempering chocolate or anything. So it's not just about the individual recipe. Does it get you from point A to point B? It's about couching you in an understanding of how to approach this recipe, whether that's a cultural understanding, it's technique, it's strategy for getting dinner that your kids will actually eat on the table. All of these things contribute in supporting the recipe and also teaching the reader how to sort of wrap their head around how the author thinks about the recipes. And then, of course, you have things like photography and design that I take into consideration as well.
No, that's really a fascinating look because you're right. As a critic, you're not thinking this isn't just about your personal taste. Maybe there's a certain ingredient. We all have an ingredient that we just don't really like, but you can't let that throw off your appreciation of the work.
You must get a lot of cookbooks sent to you, appealing to you to review. How do you select what you evaluate?
There are a bunch of different factors that go into that, right? I think that largely for me, more so now when I'm, self-published author writing for myself than when I was tied to different outlets. Now I feel like my job is to alert my readers to good books that I think are good that they might not have heard of otherwise. So I am much more likely to elevate books that I think are good and undercovered than to write nasty things about books that I don't think are very good. I don't think that that's super helpful for readers. When I worked for major publications, then it was often, is my reader likely to buy this book? Whether it's, one of the bigger titles coming out that year, or, it's something that I know is going to be a success. It's by a big name chef. It's by a celebrity that's very famous. And in those cases, it's more if my reader is going to be disappointed by this book that I'm pretty sure they're going to be interested in buying, then I need to tell them that. I do that less so now because I think that that's less useful for coming from just like a person sending an email newsletter all the time. I would much rather just, be like, forget about the bad stuff. Let's make sure everyone has access to these books that they might not have heard of otherwise. And then the other thing I look for is I look for really interesting things that people are doing that's maybe new. They have tinkered with the structure of a recipe, the standard structure of a recipe in a way I think is really interesting, or it's a concept I haven't seen before, or the art is really good. In recent years, I've been really interested in self-published stuff. I think there's really interesting things happening outside of the traditional major publishing houses that people are just kind of doing weird stuff on their own. So that's the kind of stuff I look for now.
Do you sometimes get a book that you really think is going to be great and you get into it and you think, oh, shoot, I'm sad, but this book just doesn't pull it together. It's like it's missing some fundamentals, even though I really am rooting for this underdog to succeed.
You don't have to name names.
That hasn't happened in a very long time. Not a very long time. It hasn't happened in a while. And I think that part of that is because cookbooks have blown up so much in the past, 10 years. I think that people take them more seriously. I think that when I first started doing this, it was more common to find a book that was just kind of haphazardly thrown together without terribly much care. And now I think that it's a much more competitive field, and the books I get tend to be more, they feel like they have more discipline behind them. So I'm much less disappointed by books than I used to be, surprise disappointed, right? So I can generally tell from flipping through a book that, I find the concept appealing. There are 15 different recipes in here that I would make even if it wasn't my job. And, it looks nice and the writing is intriguing and grabs at me and all of these things. I can usually tell that just from flipping through. So it's not like I'm excited about a book and it shows up and, I look at it and it's just somehow not what it was purported to be. That doesn't happen as much anymore. I will say that sometimes books come out that I had kind of built myself up for, and then I get it and I'm just like, I guess, I don't know, these recipes are okay. It's fine. I'm sure they work, but it's not that dynamite, oh my God, I have to cook these recipes books. But that doesn't make them bad books. That just makes them maybe not for me.
Right. Well, can you get into the specifics about what you see when you're flipping through those pages?
Sure. I am really interested in how people tackle the concept of whole kitchen systems. So anywhere that anyone is talking about leftovers or pantry things in an interesting way, this is one of my big nuts to crack when it comes to cookbooks, and I haven't really seen a way to do it where I'm like, yes, that's the way to do it. So I'm always interested when someone tries it from a new angle. Do you guys know what I'm talking about?
Yeah, because it's like you write a recipe and you think, oh man, I'm asking the reader, the cook, to invest all this time in it. And you really want to have that person do it to the max and then also like incorporate it into their lives. And we only have so much space on that darn page.
Yeah.
And what do they do with leftovers? And what do they do about make ahead? And all of a sudden, this very flat thing called a recipe that's on a page becomes this three-dimensional object that you are trying to present visually, verbally, and it becomes a little monster.
Yeah, exactly. And talented home cooks don't cook these recipes that exist in their own little bubble. They cook because they have the stock in their freezer and they have this seasoning already made and they have this pickle already, whatever. And so like telling people how to talk about that in a way that makes sense is very, very difficult. And I'm still waiting to see a book that's like, oh my God, they did it. But there are really cool different ways people approach that. So that's one thing I look for. I think how people handle variations is also very interesting because some recipes, you don't have to make them exactly how they're written, like to the weight, to the gram of the ingredients. So how do people deal with that? Are you offering your readers enough guidance, but giving them options? Sometimes cookbooks will give you so many variations that you get I feel a little lost. Like sometimes I'm just like, tell me what to do. Don't give me 17 different ways to make this. Maybe give me one way and then 3 options or whatever. So I find variations is another, sometimes I'll see how people deal with that. And I find it very intriguing. Just generally anything about and just flipping through a book and being like, yes, I want to make that for dinner. Like I will get up off my desk and drive to the grocery store right now and I will make that for dinner tonight. Like anything like that is golden. And then, intriguing photography. Photography is such a huge part of it. Illustrations also. I love a chart.
Are you taking notes of all the things Paula likes? She likes a chart. She likes illustrations. Just
diagrams.
Right.
Yep. Anyway, that's like a new way to present information, I'm automatically into.
That's the hardest thing about cookbooks, right? There's so much information you want to get across the page, but you also know that people get frustrated when you give them too much information, that there's that balance. And Andrea, that's something that you just do so well throughout your work of like, okay, do I tell them that it has to be this amount of ginger? Do I specify the inch or do I just say a thumb?
But it's so hard because, so much of what I do are recipes that many people have never made. And so I'm trying to sell you really hard and make it accessible and make it appealing and all of that stuff. But people are interested in new flavors. But, Paula, a lot of times in Stained Pages, your newsletter, you take a look at old books too. And that's one of the pleasures. I love it when you go back and you take a look at favorite, books that people may or may not have remembered. And back then, way back then, people had a certain common sense of methods and a common pantry. So it was like easier to, I think, do what you're saying in terms of discussing variations and what to, how to deal with the average American cook's kitchen, the same equipment. And now we have so many options. It kind of like creates like this octopus that you're just trying to wrestle when it comes to recipe writing as well as cookbook reviewing.
I mean, this is where I get really interested in like exactly how do people deal with that? I don't know that I have the answer. I think that something that's really interesting is that what we've replaced, perhaps what would have been a common pantry, 50, 60 years ago, was so many more options. And so if you can provide people with guidelines maybe of how to use a hot sauce in this recipe, and maybe it's a Vietnamese hot sauce, maybe it is a Cajun hot sauce, that you can find a way to write about things that these older cookbooks would have perhaps taken for granted in a way that accommodates a more modern, diverse pantry. But yeah, I mean, it's definitely a tricky strategy for writing a cookbook is how do you incorporate all these things? I think that older cookbooks, to a certain extent, took some things for granted. Took for granted that your average home cook knew certain things, had certain things in their pantry, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But I think that right now we have such better access to imported ingredients, more specialty ingredients than they could assume that the average home cook had access to. And I'm thinking specifically of like, if you look at a book from 60s, 70s, 80s, say an Italian cookbook, and they're calling for all these exotic cheeses. And we know you can't get good ricotta, so replace it with cottage cheese. Well, people can get good ricotta now, but they can also get 70 different types of kimchi, and they can also get, like all these different things. So I think that you replace the one, like shortcuts to a recipe with just like, but you can actually make the food now,
Yes. Right.
Paula, when it comes to looking at books for, your reviews, do blurbs matter to you? The endorsements from other folks that are on the cover or inside the cover?
No. Like not at all. Honestly, I use the blurbs mostly because if I am unfamiliar with the author and I see the blurbs are, say, all people with ties to a random city or like way more famous than I would have expected or something like that, then I'm like, okay, who is this person? Oh, it's a chef in Vancouver. Or, oh, this is a person with a show on some network I've never heard of or something like that. Like I use them as sort of context clues. I don't take them as vouching for the book. I mean, they are vouching for the book, but...
Yeah, they're vouching. And that's the nice part. They're always nice. And I've blurred for books and, when it's time to go out to get blurbs for books, authors and editors, as you know, Paula, we consider them quite seriously in terms of how to frame our work. But now we know for a reviewer like you, it's like, no big deal.
Right, exactly. Like I am going to dig into the book deeply enough that what they say doesn't matter. Did this person work for a famous restaurant? And so other people work for the famous restaurant. And then I'll know like, oh, okay, this is where they're coming from.
Yeah, no, but that context is very important so that you understand, where the author is coming from. So in that regard, blurbs do matter. So I'm going to think about that for my next book.
Yeah, that's a really good tip. I had never thought of that, Paula. Thank you for sharing that, actually, the context. That's awesome.
Good. Well, I'm glad I could help.
For people who have had one of their books reviewed by you, what do you hope, they get out of a critique?
Well, I don't know. I don't write them for authors. I write them for the readers because I think it's really important for people to like have an informed decision when they buy a book. But I think that for an author, well, okay, so the first thing I'll say is that I know for a fact that bad reviews sell as many books as good reviews. Like I can see who clicks through on the links. And so
wow,
that's great.
Yes. Second of all, I'm always going into testing recipes with the assumption, and I think this is fair, that the author of the book knows way more about their subject matter than I do. So I am always going to give them the benefit of the doubt. But here's a little nugget I will get you. I have reviewed books that the recipe didn't work and had people who tested recipes on the book reach out to me and say, I knew it. I knew that one didn't work. Thank you for saying that didn't work.
Wow.
So yeah, I guess trust your recipe testers. Don't listen to me.
You don't always have to be nice in a book review, right?
No, although I try to be fair.
Yeah, because sometimes things just don't work out. But, if you've got the professional eagle eye and you're looking at it, I don't know. I sometimes read cookbook reviews and I totally understand, the thing. If you're self-publishing, you're looking out for your readership's ability to find a gem that they can add to their collection. Mm-hmm. And so what's the point of saying something that's super duper negative? But professionally, I feel like, when you compare cookbook reviews to like regular book reviews that you say read in the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, whatever, they're not always nice, but cookbook reviews are pretty nice.
Yeah, and I think that I definitely think there's room for negative cookbook reviews. I think that generally they should be written about, there's like the old saying about don't punch down, punch up. And I think that like generally it's not useful to anyone if you find this little known book no one would have ever heard of before and say nasty things about it. But if you're talking about these like big name books that everyone wants to know, well, is it good or not? That's when you get more critical, I think. I think of cookbook criticism as sort of consumer advocacy. It's something I think people are sitting around going, oh, I just heard about this book by a big famous TV chef. Is that any good? Should I get that? Then that's a question that needs to be answered versus something no one's ever heard of.
I have a book that I absolutely love, and it's so well written. But yet one of the authors had like a bad professional experience. And so a lot of people, I feel like, treated it as if it was, nuclear hot reactive, wouldn't go near the book. Mm-hmm. But it's a solid book. Does an author's reputation impact book reviews for you?
That is a big question. Okay. Yes. Most of the, Me Too stuff and these stories that come out and reveal that chef so-and-so has done X, Y, and Z, and that's terrible. Most of my formal reviewing for big outlets predates that. I have reviewed books where, maybe one of the co-authors turns out to be not a great person, and I still use those books. I don't know that I would advise anyone to buy them because, again, consumer advocacy, put your money where you want it to go. I will say in the newsletter, I tend to not cover those kinds of books unless there is a reason to, by which I mean if there's a news peg to it or something, but I'm generally not going to write up the cookbook as a cookbook. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. Yeah, that makes sense. So with that, though, I want to ask about your own experience writing your cookbook. How was that? What was that like being in the author seat instead of on
the other side?
Yeah. I mean, I'm going to use the restaurant analogy. This is like going from being the restaurant critic to opening up your own restaurant.
Yeah, it was really valuable. So I wrote my first book I wrote it in 2016. It came out in 2018. And it was just like such a valuable experience. I'm so glad I did it, even if I had never written another book again and just like went straight back into pure cookbook criticism. I didn't understand how much of it is out of control of the author. And I want to say that I had a fabulous experience. My publisher was Abrams, and I had a fabulous experience working with them. None of this is criticism of them. But just like, I don't think I understood that, like, you don't get to pick your cover necessarily. Like, you can weigh in on it, but like the publisher is ultimately going to have final say, or, which pictures go where, and like that you aren't like the author isn't fine tuning the design and all of that. I mean, maybe some authors are, I wasn't. And I think it made me much more, just like going through every single step of the process made me not realize, but like when I write about cookbooks, I write about them differently because I've had this experience.
If the writing's really strong and the recipes are really strong and maybe the design isn't quite there, it may be interpreting that book in a different way now that you've been through that because you're not really sure how much say the author had in the design.
Right, exactly. And I mean, I still kind of have to use the author's name as shorthand for the parties responsible for this book, but so many of the decisions that go into a book where like page numbers are on the page. Author doesn't have control.
Can we just talk about page numbers for a second? Because I have a thing about page numbers, and I think my publishers might think I'm a little strange, but I think it's really trendy now to move the page number into a different part of the page. Oh. And it drives me bonkers because I'm using that index and I'm looking to where they have the, sweet potato recipe. And I want to be able to flip through the pages and not have like a guessing game on where the page number is. But I feel like I kind of fight this battle a lot. And I'm probably just like, oh God, here comes Kate. She's going to have a page number complaint on these like first page of design. So yeah, I mean, I don't know when page numbers became so creatively placed, but I'm really into the bottom right corner. I'm pretty traditional with that.
I feel like an old geezer sometimes when it comes to designs and trends and stuff. Paula, well, you see so many cookbooks pass through your door and on your desk. I'm sure you have piles of them. Are page numbers this thing of Kate's and page numbers, and obviously yours too? Are they part of the trends that you see, in terms of design?
I've definitely seen the page numbers, the thing where they put the page number in the center on the edge. I've seen a lot of that. And it makes it hard to flip through because you want to use your thumb to flip through to find the page number. And if it's in the middle, it's much harder. So I feel you on the page numbers. It's funny because I think that one of the things that say your Goodreads reviewer or your average home cook who buys a cookbook and reviews it online, one of the things that they will almost always ding people for is having to turn the page in the middle of the recipe. They do not want to see the ingredients on one page and instruction on the other and have to flip back to find out okay, how much salt? Okay, how much of this? And so I have actually seen in recent years more and more, I feel like people are doing 2 or even 3 column recipes to avoid that, which I think is great. I think people are much more willing to use color, not just in the photography, but in the actual printing, which I love. I love just a colorful, bright, rainbow colored cookbook because they should be fun. They shouldn't be serious and dowdy. Oh, so to prepare for this, I went through and looked at all the summer and fall titles that are coming up. And I have thrilled to have seen a lot more cookbooks that don't have photography on the cover, but have illustration. Or some really striking graphic design, which has been a thing forever in the UK and Australia. But for some reason in the US, we just do big beauty photos of food. So there are a few titles coming out this fall that are more in that. I'm excited about it. They're gorgeous. And then you can see the American version and it's here's your
another
bowl of
salad.
Yeah, exactly. So I think those are fun.
Ooh, actually, let's jump into that. Let's talk a little bit about, looking in the crystal ball. What are you seeing coming down the pipeline? What should we be expecting going into fall 2022 and maybe into next year?
Something that's really interesting that's happening right now is we're starting to see all the books come out that were pitched in 2020. When the pandemic hit and people were at home all the time and they were okay, it's now or never. I got to shoot my shot. What cookbooks are coming out of that? So I'm hoping, and I'm seeing a little bit of this, weird stuff, people writing the book they were always meant to write. Last year we had a lot of the pantry books that were kind of pitched during the early days of the pandemic and turned around quick to take advantage of that pantry cooking moment. Now I feel we're seeing the passion projects coming out of that. So that I think is something to keep an eye out for that could be really exciting. I'm seeing a lot of angles on especially international cuisines, but just topics that have been covered before. So I'm talking about any cuisine around the world vegan coming out this fall, gluten-free stuff, international baking, these kinds of things that are okay, there have been big Mexican cookbooks, but there hasn't been a big Panaderia cookbook. So let's do that.
I would totally buy that in a heartbeat. No question.
Right?
Yeah. Well, that's very exciting because, no longer are people interested in survey books. They're general books. They want to just really dial down into single subject, which is for a writer like me who's written single subject books. It's thrilling. It's one of the most exciting thing to just not just be passionate, but frankly, obsessing. And It's all about the obsession at the end of the line for me.
Yeah, I think that a lot of people realize, I don't know, this is true of my friends, this is true of my readers who respond to my newsletters and things, but I think people sort of discovered, again, in 2020, over the course of having to be home, that a cookbook can be sort of a short-term hobby. I'm trying to figure out why people are drawn to single subject books, but I've had a lot of friends who are I want to get really into sourdough bread is the famous example, but I want to get really into hand-shaped pasta, or I really want to get into Japanese milk bread, or I really want to get into making dumplings, or whatever the thing is. And then they buy the book, and then for a few months, they're every weekend, well, let's pick another thing out of the book. And it's it's like taking a class, but you're using a book. So I think that a lot of people are getting into that kind of thing.
That's really important, actually, to point out for people who are listening, who are looking for their first cookbook idea, because I do do think you're right. Providing that really engaging deep dive into a specific subject can be really rewarding for the writer and the reader at the end. I mean, being able to, when I was, I think 19, I had like the Nancy Silverton Breads of La Brea Bakery book. And man, I baked through that. And I was feeding my sourdough starter in college and I was into it. And it's just really great to see, 20 years later, like this whole trend, different books, but still the same idea of cooking or baking your way through that single subject. I love that. With that said, yeah, I wanted to know if we could learn a little bit more about a project you might be working on, if you can tease us, or is it still under wraps?
Yeah, so I have two. So last fall, like a big dummy, I was working on 2 books at once. Which was a lot of work. That's why the newsletter went down to 1 issue a week. Hopefully we'll get it back up to 2 again at some point. But I can tell you that one, I was working on recipe testing for Texas Monthly. It's like a modern Texas cookbook. And so I was honored to help develop and test recipes for that.
Awesome.
And then my other one I can tell you less about, but it is a collaboration with a chef. It is really putting my whole how do you work with variations in a recipe conundrum to the test.
All right, Paula, this is this thing of like the hobby. You get to provide the answer to your own question. Yep,
it's been just like a total, like I feel like I'm playing 3-dimensional chess with recipes constantly, but it's been really fun, really rewarding. So, and that's spring 24 title.
Okay, so that's something that you're working on that you'll be turning in next spring, just so listeners get a idea of like the turnaround time. You'll turn it in spring 2023 for a spring 2024 release?
Before the holidays. It's due before the holidays.
Before that's right, because everything's moved up now. Because both,
shipping
and
everything is taking so much longer.
Yeah.
So it's
so the panic is on. Sorry, not the panic, the pressure.
We're doing okay. We're about half done. It'll get there, I think.
So we'll just have to stay tuned to hear, more about that project. Paula, tell us a little bit more about Stained Page News. Where can listeners find it and subscribe, and what can they expect going forward in terms of content?
So it's at stainedpagenews.com. Currently, I'm publishing once a week on Fridays. Every other week goes out to paid subscribers only. Every other week goes out to the entire free list. We do a lot. I do accept pitches from freelancers also, which if anyone is listening and wants to pitch me, I pay stainedpagenews@gmail.com. Yeah, we do deep dives into old books, guides to niche subgenres of cookbooks, like the kids cookbook piece that just ran last week. In August, I do my big fall cookbook preview where I talk about all the titles I'm excited that are coming out in the fall cookbook season. That's like my big showpiece thing I do. I do it 3 times a year, but the fall one is by far the biggest. I do interviews with cookbook authors. We had an interview with Kate, probably almost a year ago. Yeah, just lots of good. Oh, and then cookbook news. I cover book deals. I cover trends in the industry. I cover weird experiments in self-publishing. So if you want to read about that, subscribe. And if you are up to any of that kind of stuff, let me know.
Right. Well, and also if I, especially on the self-publishing side, if I would like to submit my book for you to potentially review it, how do I do that? What do people do?
Yeah, self-published people email me all the time. So please do. I find that as interesting, if not more interesting, than the books coming out of the major publishing houses. I kind of discover stuff on Kickstarter and things like that sometimes too. Email me is the answer to all of the questions.
We'd love to have you back to talk about self-publishing, because I think that, going rogue, we all dream of it, and some of us do and some of us don't. It's thrilling to be able to put together a book on your own. We'd love to have you back in the future for that.
Sure, yeah. It opens a lot of doors for people, as hard as it is. So you can do weird stuff.
Right. And, you can put your page numbers wherever you want. And you don't have to take my advice.
Yeah.
Well, thanks again for joining us, Paula. This has been such a lovely chat, and we can't wait to have you back.
Thanks. This was super fun. I'd love to come back.
Thanks for listening to Everything Cookbooks. If you have questions or comments, contact us through our website, everythingcookbooks.com. If you have a question that you want answered on the podcast, leave us a voice memo. There's a link on our contact page. If you have a few seconds to spare, please leave a review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen. It helps more people find the show. Much gratitude goes out to our editor, Abby Cirquitella. Thanks for joining us, and until next time, keep on cooking.